hope shorter remarks, because I find the discussion more useful usually than the actual presentation. So I will try to make my remarks brief and get sort of highlight enough material for us to discuss. The point is, as Nicholas already mentioned, it's very personal that I'm a Muslim and I'm committed also to international human rights. I'm committed to constitutionalism and universal values of various perspectives, and therefore it's a personal quest to come to terms with what it means to be Muslim today in a globalized world, in an interactive and very fast-moving world. For my work, I mean, it is relevant to mention this, that some 30 years ago I started, since after graduating from law school and being part of a movement in Sudan that was eventually suppressed by the mid-80s, and that's why I had to leave the country. But the point is that I was working with my teachers' ideas about transforming Muslims' understanding of Sharia. And I'll touch on this briefly, but from that, I seem to have assumed that if we can get a progressive enough understanding of Sharia, it can in fact be enforced by the state without creating negative outcomes. More recently, rather over the last 10 years, gradually coming to terms with the idea that whatever Sharia is, it is not for the state to enforce. And that's what I'll be talking about, taking off from the book which is called Islam and the Secular State, Negotiating the Future of Sharia, to try to take it further, because that book was I described it in the preface as my final statement, but not my last statement, meaning that I have come to accept this as a matter of principle, as a matter of personal commitment, and for me as a Muslim, as something that I'm willing to be accountable for. And I think that is also important to mention. It's not just simply an intellectual or a scholarly position, I hope, but it's also a personal position for which I'm accountable. And now what I'm trying to do is to try to elaborate further on that basic statement. And specifically, my understanding of the notion of the secular state as a mediation of competing claims, that it is not in itself an answer to many of the profound moral questions and political questions that we have to resolve and confront personally and collectively as communities, but it is the most conducive, I think, framework for mediation of those tensions. As I'm saying, I'm trying to take this further, but trying to advance, and maybe today is a way of trying to test this, a general theory of religion and the state. I work very much with Islam and the state as a Muslim, and where that is most problematic, I find, in current discourse. But I would like to take it further to say, if you can elaborate a general theory of religion and the state rather than Islam and the state alone, and to see if we can present that point. If that theory is viable, then Islam would be a variable rather than the defining paradigm. That is, the question would be, it is about the secular state as a mediation of competing claims. For Muslims, it happens to be Islam is the variable. For others, it would be other variables. And at the end of my remarks, I will try to raise the possibility of whether we can talk about ideology and the state, not only religion and the state. So whether what I'm saying about religion and the state applies also to ideology and the state. And Islam is not only a variable, I take it, but also it is a contingent variable. That is, there is no single Islam that's always going to be the variable in question. But specific experiences of Islam, understandings of Islam, different contextually, historically, and therefore it is about a variable of a variable. To understand Islam as a variable in the broader theory, and to understand that variable itself in terms of its contingency. The book that was mentioned about African constitutionalism and the role of Islam, in fact, the title used to be The Contingent Role of Islam. but the publisher thought it was too long, so they dropped the contingent part. The idea being that Islam does not play the same role everywhere, and therefore understanding what causes particular manifestations of the Islamic variable in the debate about the state is something that we can study and discuss. Now, as I said, I will try to be brief in presenting sort of my most, I would say, heretical maybe or radical positions. My claim is that it is not only that the state should not be Islamic, but that the state cannot be Islamic. That the state, and this point is not only in terms of that obviously the state as an institution cannot have a religion. It's not only that, but that there is no Islamic quality which we can ascribe to any institution. That the notion of what is Islamic is so contingent, is so subjective, is so discursive, that there is no agreed understanding of what it is that is Islamic, so that we can humanly verify whether it is true or not about any institution. So my claim is very fundamental. It is not that I should struggle against the notion of an Islamic state, but I should reject the very idea of an Islamic state. And my claim is that it has never been. That again, because the reason I try to, even like in my talking points here, I have it, why do I have to be so radical? It's because I want to dispel the illusion of an Islamic state. So long as people that believe it is possible and that maybe this experiment or that experiment is not working out well, I would like to challenge the very idea so that it can never be. And therefore we can just move on to something else. I mean, to talk about how to understand the relationship between Islam and the state, Islam and politics, in a different light than the possibility of something called an Islamic state. That my claim is that the notion of an Islamic state is conceptually incoherent. It's a conceptual impossibility. Because what is Islamic is unverifiable. We cannot decide that. It is a very subjective understanding, always, I think. It's unprecedented that it never happened in history. There was never a time when there was an Islamic state. And that is untenable today, that we cannot have it. And of course, we can be more specific about the various aspects of this when we come to the discussion. The second general point I would like also to make is that Sharia, which is the normative system of Islam, broadly speaking, cannot be enforced by the state. Not that it should not, but that it cannot. Meaning that the very nature of Sharia defies state enforcement. When the state claims to enforce Sharia, it is changing its character. What is being enforced is necessarily secular and cannot be Sharia as Muslims understand it to be a divine dispensation. And here, maybe to clarify, I would like to distinguish between what I call the concept of Sharia and the content, methodology, and context. Most people, at least most Muslims, when they speak about Sharia, they are talking about the idea of Sharia. And of course, according to their own understanding, but they are conflating, they are collapsing an ideal of what Sharia ought to be with a very human, contingent, contextual understanding of what it is. So I think it is helpful to make the distinction so that we can appreciate why people are so attached to the idea of Sharia, but to understand that whatever it is always going to be humanly constructed. So in other words, part of my claim is that Sharia is secular. It is not divine. That as a Muslim, I believe that the Quran is divine for me as a Muslim, the Sunnah of the Prophet is divine for me as a Muslim, but any human understanding of what Sharia is precisely that it is human, and therefore cannot be divine, cannot claim the authority or the divinity of the divine. That the nature of Sharia has evolved through an intergenerational consensus process. That is, there is no enactment process and no enacting authority. That you could not trace any principle of what Muslims accept today as Sharia to a founding moment when it came to be. That whatever came to be accepted over time as Sharia has been a product of people making propositions, interpreting the texts as they understand them, and then over time that idea or that proposition get accepted or rejected. If it gets accepted, eventually it becomes incorporated into the corpus of what Muslims accept as Sharia. But that it is, you cannot trace it to a moment or an institution or an authority that declares what Sharia is. And I think that my claim is that Muslim scholarship historically has always been about Sharia as suppositional. And that Muslim scholars, the Arabic term for it is zanni. They never claim that this is Sharia. It's always about this is what I think Sharia is. And that is not out of just humility, which is, I think, good enough, but it's also out of a sense of the impossibility, the unknowability of Sharia. That if Sharia is of the divine, it is not possible for the human to know it as it is. We can only speculate at what we think it is, but we can never definitively, categorically define and determine what Sharia is. And if that is so, then it's just simply, there is no, as I said, verifiable understanding that is universally accepted, that can be enforced by any state. And the idea of enforcement itself violates the essence of Sharia, my claim is. Again, why I need to be so categorical about this is that, again, to dispel the illusion that any state can ever enforce Sharia. And because so long as that illusion remains, someone will try to do it. And I think inevitably there are going to be disastrous outcomes. That it is not only that it should not be done, it cannot be done. I remember I had an encounter in northern Nigeria a few years back when they were sort of venturing into this notion of enforcement of Sharia in the northern states of Nigeria. And my point was, it was a huge conference about Sharia in Nigeria. And I said that you cannot do this. It's not only that you should not do it, but you cannot do it. And about 200 people walked out of the room on me at that point. But still, I think that I need to be so categorical, as I say, because it is either this proposition is true or false. If it is true, I think it will be very liberating for Muslims to understand that it is not something that we should try to do, but we are failing short of doing it properly. But it's something that we should not try to do because it is undoable altogether. Now, about the secular state, again trying to clarify what I mean by it. My definition of it in the book is a secular state is one that is neutral regarding religious doctrine. That it does not take a position on religion. That it does not claim to have any authority or competence to deal with Sharia or with religion, any religion. And if I'm right, then that might be a general theory of religion and the state. And the idea of it is that people tend to define the secular state in counter opposition to religious. So the secular state is one that is not religious. What is religious is that what is not secular. And I find this sort of definition not only just futile because it is circular, because it neither defines what is religious is and what is secular is. It defines them in relation to mutual exclusion. What's religious is not secular, what's secular is not religious. But I think for me, as a Muslim engaged in these struggles politically, the implication of defining the secular in counter opposition to the religious is counterproductive for Muslims because it evokes this image of hostility to religion or absence of religion. So the idea that if the state is secular, then it is hostile to religion. Of course, they have French laicity in mind and Turkish varieties of it. That's how Muslims react to the idea. So by trying to move from defining the secular state in terms of only neutrality regarding religion, I propose to go further to say what it is rather than what it is not. The idea of the state being sort of a secular state being non-religious, as I said, is not only circular, but also it defines the state in terms of something that it cannot do anyway. So if the state cannot be religious, to say that a secular state is a non-religious state is not to say anything, because you are just simply defining it in terms of something that I would like to affirm is not for the state to do in any case. It is incapable of doing. So you don't achieve much by just describing it in terms of being non-religious. I would rather move on to say, okay, what is it? What is the actual institution, its nature, its qualities, other than just simply its neutrality regarding religious doctrine. And this is the idea of mediation or negotiation is what comes here, I think, to mind. The one proposition for me I find to be important is to affirm that the neutrality of the state regarding religion has to be not only just simply neutrality, but also not indifference and not hostility. That is, that the state is not neutral only, but it is not indifferent either to religion, and it is not hostile to religion. And that's where you get really into the thick of it. I mean, because to speak about neutrality is sort of comforting, but as soon as you get to the what does it mean, how does it work out, that's where you get the real, I think, challenge and difficulty and so on. And I have to admit here again, I hope I'm not disappointing anybody here by saying that I'm not for secularism as a humanist ideology or philosophy. I'm a religious person, I'm a believer, and the object of struggling for a secular state is as a means to be religious, not as a means of dispensing with religion. The idea for me is that the secular state, as I define it in the sense of not only neutrality regarding religion, but also substantive safeguards and institutions and norms, what I'll try to clarify in a minute, this idea, this thing that I call the secular state is a means to be religious. And to me, being religious is more fundamental than everything else. I mean, that everything else is a means to that end, which is a means to my own end, which is my own sort of liberation and freedom. To make to give a little more meat, as I said, and substance to the idea of neutrality of the state, I make a distinction between the state and politics. To me, the state is the institutional continuity of sovereignty of a people, whereas politics are the political choices people make from time to time. So in a way, again, to almost to abridge, the idea here is that politics is what governments are about. The state is where institutional continuity of sovereignty is about. And the example that I find useful in the American context is to recall the dismissal of the federal prosecutors by the Justice Department during the Bush administration. That was an example of collapsing the state and politics. An example of how the institutional autonomy and continuity of the state Justice Department was compromised to advance a political agenda. And to me, totalitarianism is exactly that. It is about collapsing the state and politics. So the more we can disentangle or disaggregate, I call it a distinction, not a dichotomy. Because the state is a political institution. but in a different way than what the politics of every government or administration is about. So the more we can maintain an understanding of politics as something that is transient, something that we can, of course we can change our mind about the state too, but my point is more about that the political sort of impact on the state is slower and also should be more deliberative than what political choices we make and changes in our political options that we can develop. And to safeguard that distinction between the state and politics, I refer to constitutionalism, human rights, and citizenship. To me, these are the pillars, or this tripartite sort of construction or idea is what gives substance to what I mean by the secular state. It's not only the one that's neutral regarding religion, but it's one that is also consistent with the principles of constitutionalism, also respectful of citizenship and protective of human rights. So the tripartite condition of these three paradigms to enable something I call civic reason. And the idea of civic reason is similar to Raoul's idea of public reason, but it's different. I think it is different in that, in fact, in the first draft of the book, I used to take the terms public reason, but then I kept explaining every time that, but I don't mean public reason as Raoul's means it. So eventually someone helped me by an idea of why not call it something else, and the notion of civic reason came up as an alternative. The idea of civic reason is the need to give reasons and to engage in reasoning processes about public policy and legislation that does not reference religious conviction. That our choices, our political choices about what the state should do and what the government should do should not be premised on our religious convictions. That we must develop and cultivate. I think it is something that we have to cultivate. It is not totally absent, but it's never fully present either. And every society has to struggle with this, how to cultivate and how to sustain the ability to give reasons for our public policy positions that are not premised on our religious convictions. One way of making the point is that we should maybe try to distinguish between the normative value in a religious doctrine and the religious doctrine. So the normative value in many religious doctrines actually is shared. It's about lying is bad, cheating is bad, fair dealing is good, respecting other people's safety, dignity, humanity is good. These are values that underpin the theological, so-called doctrinal expression of what that means. So, for example, the idea of theft, to steal, is a sin, and to steal is a crime. But the reason that it's a crime is not the fact that it is a sin. The ability to articulate reasons for why to penalize something without invoking divine command for it is what I mean by civic reason. And whatever the policy is, it can even be something to do about financial regulation or about healthcare. So whatever it is, now I think, of course, and that's part of the difficulty, is that people's motivation for taking political positions may very well derive from the religious convictions. But their ability to persuade other citizens must be independent of their own motivation. So that if I'm advancing a position about healthcare, or about financial regulation, whatever the issue might be, I should be able to articulate reasons without saying because God said so. The fact that God said so is immaterial, is irrelevant, it is contestable. People have never agreed about what God, if there is a God to start with, let alone what God said and what God meant by what God said. I'm trying to be gender neutral here. Instead of saying what he said and what, you get into that part. I see Lashon is here, so I have to be careful with my language. So this is the notion. The notion is it's a mediation of a paradox. It's a paradox of the connectedness of religion and politics, and the need to separate religion from the state, and the connectedness of the state and politics. So politics seem to be the shared medium where the state is political in one sense, but also the politics of the day also are political in a different sense. And religion is integral to the way people decide what to do and why to do it. That is their motivation, their understanding of the public good for the believers. I'm not saying that everybody, but for the believers is informed by the religious convictions. But that should not be the medium in which you communicate your persuasiveness to other citizens. The challenge is to be persuasive without invoking your religious doctrine. And it is amazing that, I take heart in, I was doing something for another paper recently, and I came across a story which is reported about something that happened in the 10th century of the Common Era. A theologian who was coming back, he was from Andalusia, he was coming back from the Maghrib, from the west of the Muslim world to the east, and he went to visit Baghdad, which was at that point the high point of the imperial state of the Abbasids and so on. And then on his way back, he was in Cairo, and a friend of his asked him, "Tell me what's going on in Baghdad, what's up there?" And he said, "You can't believe what I saw." He said, "I went to this debate in which Muslims, Jews, Christians, heretics, apostates of every variety were debating issues of theology and policy and so on the understanding that none of them is to invoke their religious doctrine." He said, as soon as they walked in and they congregated, he said someone stood up and said, the chair or the moderator probably, stood up and said, "Leave your religious conviction at the door. You cannot cite to us your prophet or your scripture because we don't accept your prophet or scripture." So of course, this man was telling the story in total disbelief. He was shocked at the way things were in Baghdad. But to me, that is civic reason. The idea that people were there to debate, bracketing their religious convictions or religious scripture as something that they cannot invoke in debating the point with their sort of protagonist, is exactly what I'm hoping for. So it is not something that is, I think, new or different. It is just something that we have not named before. It's something that we have not thought about in articulation of what's really going on. Of course, there are reasons why that was going on in Baghdad of the 10th century, and it is not possible to go on in Baghdad of the 21st century. And that has to do with colonialism, and has to do with the decline in Muslim civilizations and sort of the defensiveness. So it is the ability to engage in civic reason is a reflection of our self-confidence in the stability of our social institutions and political institutions. To the extent that we are comfortable with that and our economic prosperity, our security, we can engage more, I think, creatively in what I mean by civic reason. Moving on also to conclusion soon, to say that, of course, I'm a lawyer, so eventually it has somehow to come to what it means legally speaking. And we can look, my claim that this is a general theory of religion and the state. It's not only a general theory about Islam and the state, but religion and the state at large. But for Muslims in particular, I want to be clear that what I mean is not only applicable to Muslim minorities, but applicable to Muslim majorities too. So the idea is that whatever it is, if it is a coherent sort of legitimate idea, it has to apply to Muslims regardless of demographics. And it has to apply to other believers too, but I'm not venturing into how that might be at this point in any case. So the idea of the distinction between what I call normative pluralism and legal pluralism. That is, people subscribe to a variety of normative systems. We all do that. And we all owe fidelity and allegiance to different normative systems. But that should be distinguished from legal pluralism. I believe, and I know that some people find it problematic, I believe in legal uniformity combined with normative pluralism. That is, a state that is neutral, or a secular state as I see it, is one that enables normative pluralism but also defends or opposes legal pluralism. That when we talk about law and state law, we have to talk about a single uniform law that applies to everybody, regardless of their normative convictions and affiliations. But at the same time, we have to balance that with creating the space and the possibility for people to live with normative pluralism, that is to affiliate, to identify with religious, with other types of normative ideas, that does not sort of contradict their commitment to upholding the rule of law in the uniform sense. So my idea here is that I argue that, as I said already, that Islamic law or Sharia cannot be enforced by the state. Not only that it cannot be enforced by the state. But Muslims may have allegiance to Sharia and have ways of conformity with Sharia that is not inconsistent with their obligation to uphold the state law as the law of the land. And here is where you get the interesting sort of dynamics of how do you do that, and how do you, and my point about this being a general theory is that this is a general theory about the state and state societies generally. That whatever the state is, it's not only about religion, that people always have to accept the supremacy of a state law at the expense of some other commitments, at least in a way that enables them to contest what the state law is, but they have to abide by it while it lasts, while it is standing and formally acknowledged and authoritatively established. And the simple example to give is about people who are so opposed to the healthcare bill. There are people who see it as a disaster, a total outrage. But the idea that once adopted institutionally through your constitutionally acknowledged means of enacting law, you have to abide by it. You can continue to struggle to change the law, but you are not free to violate the law because you don't personally agree with it. So it's a general difficulty. And of course you get in the field of, or the idea of sort of the right to rebellion, or the right to sort of conscientious objection to law. There is a space where people may feel so strongly about an issue that they are willing to confront the law by defying it and stand and accept the consequences. That is, I think, a legitimate and a healthy type of commitment. So that sort of the Mahatma Gandhi type of idea of sort of, in order to expose the hypocrisy, the double standards, or the injustice of law, you can defy it, but you defy it openly and you defy it peacefully because you want to create a counter movement in order to change the law. But you cannot just simply claim the right to defy the law and claim the right not to suffer consequences for defying the law. And that is part of the issues that I hope we can discuss today. So it is to conclude here, I'm saying that it's a general theory about religion and the state. It's about religion probably and ideology too, because the idea could be extended to ideology. So am I saying that the state should be neutral regarding ideology as well as being neutral regarding religion? I would like to think so. But I have not thought through the part about ideology, and maybe this conversation will help me think about this. The question ultimately will become where we begin, here and now. The point for me is that we always have to begin where we are. There is no way of beginning anywhere else. That is, I cannot sort of, I'm a Muslim from Sudan, you know, by the way, that was not clear already. So I'm a Muslim from Sudan, that's where I start. I cannot sort of shed anything about who I am, where I am, in order to start something glorious and beautiful like this idea of the secular state. And my claim also is that wherever we are, there is a beginning to what we are talking about, that it is not totally absent. The state is never religious. It may not be secular enough. So the question is how to enhance the secularity of the state from wherever we are, whatever positions we take, and to diminish a sort of the illusion of its religiosity. It is sort of, I'm trying to argue that conceptually it is never religious, but many people believe it is, or it can be. So we have to start with that. We have to start with what people think and believe, and to try to challenge that, to transform it. And I think if we make the case for it, it will be extremely liberating. I think there are many Muslims around the world who would like to believe this, but needed to be reasoned, needed to be justified in terms that they can defend, and more importantly, in terms that they can live with. And this is my effort. So I will leave it at this, and hopefully for the discussion to clarify further. Thank you very much. Yes, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Most enlightening and most interesting. May I have your understanding? I would like to pose some provocative questions. So I come from a different background. I'm Christian myself. So, and this has been a problem also for Christian societies, historically speaking. It lasted 1,000 years. It has been solved to a certain degree, not in absolute terms, but let's say to a satisfactory degree. So we don't have, I guess, the tension that we used to have after the Reformation and the Enlightenment. But I'm not sure I'm comfortable with certain points you mentioned, because I think regarding Islam and the secular state, the devil, if I may use this expression, hides in details. And let me give you an example. I have lived in Egypt for 2 years, and I have read and talked to people a lot, and they believe, for instance, that the model of a religious state is the state of the 4 righteous caliphs, and of course, you know, the state like Muhammad. So this is the model, and there is no state unless it is, you know, a state similar to the Rashidun state, something like that. And the other thing is, when you say that we have now to, so I'm not sure whether Islam has the same, I mean, itself, I'm asking the question, has, doctrinally speaking, the same separation that we see in the New Testament, where it is give to Caesar what is due to Caesar, and to God what is due to God, which is supposedly the premise of secularism in Christianity. Debatable also there, but I would like you to expand on this. And the other point is, when you're talking about reasoning without referencing religious convictions, I can understand it very well when it comes to financial regulation, even to criminal law, other areas of law. But when it comes to family law, or personal status law, let me give you an example. There has been now in France, maybe it's not the best example, but there has been a debate about the niqab, whether a woman should be allowed to wear the niqab in public schools, in public service. And there have been, for instance, examples of polygamous marriages, which is taboo, let's say, in Christian societies, according both to doctrine and to law premised, apparently, of this doctrine, and which is not in Muslim societies. How can you mediate this tension in pluralistic societies so that you have legal uniformity but normative pluralism?
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let me briefly try to respond here. On the first point, the whole discourse about an Islamic state, including evoking the Rashidun as the model and so on, is a post-colonial discourse. That is, the idea of an Islamic state is not in original Islamic sources. It is not in the Quran. It is not in the Hadith. It is not in Muslim discourse up to the 19th, early 20th century. The Quran does not mention the word state a single time. It always addresses believers as individuals or as community of believers. It never addresses an institution. So the idea of the state is not in the Quran. It is a practical necessity. It is Muslims have had states all the time, all along, yes, but they were not Islamic states. They were not Islamic state by religious doctrine. They were not Islamic state by public discourse. The term does not occur in any language of Muslim, Farsi, Arabic, any Turkish, until the mid-20th century when it comes in the discourse of the Islamic movements of people like Qutb, Maududi, and so on. So it is, for me, I call it, for those who are familiar with Arabic and the culture of the region, the notion of bid'ah is very provocative because it's the notion of innovation that is condemned as something that is heretical. So my claim is that the notion of an Islamic state is a bid'ah. Not that what I'm arguing for is the bid'ah, it is the notion of Islamic state that is a bid'ah. It is the one that is post-colonial. It uses the idea of the state as established by European colonialism. And it uses the idea of positive law as established by European colonialism. And superimpose that on the tradition of the history of Sharia and how it worked historically. The Rashidun state was not an Islamic state. In fact, there was never an Islamic state, my claim is. And this is the point. The Prophet's relationship to his community was too exceptional to be relevant. That is, if you accept that Muhammad was a prophet, then the relationship that you have with him is not a relationship with the state. And also from a religious Sharia point of view, if I accept the Prophet Muhammad as the Prophet, and therefore what he says is in fact Sharia. But that is only the Prophet who can make that claim. Nobody else can make that claim. So since Abu Bakr, the first caliph, any claim about what Sharia is simply a claim. In relation to the Prophet, because he was the source in Muslim belief of what Sharia is, therefore he could say, and the Quran said, you cannot believe unless you acknowledge and accept his judgment, the Prophet's judgment. But that is not true about Abu Bakr, and not true since Abu Bakr. In fact, the day the Prophet died and before he was buried, Muslims disagreed about fundamental questions that continue to resonate to the present time. The Shia-Sunni divide started the day the Prophet died, before he was buried. And the point also about so-called the apostasy wars. When Abu Bakr, sort of certain Arab tribes who continued to say, we are Muslims, but we will not pay zakat to the state. Because we pay that to the Prophet, but we are not going to pay it, because the idea of the state itself was alien to them. Abu Bakr felt that they were heretics, they were apostates, and should be fought and brought back to submission by force. The other major companions disagreed with Abu Bakr. Umar disagreed, the second caliph. Ali disagreed, Uthman disagreed. The three of the four. So my point is that if Umar was the caliph, not Abu Bakr, we would not have had Hurub al-Ridda. We would not have had the apostasy wars. And Abu Bakr prevailed not because he was right, but because he was the caliph. That is looking back to understand what happened, is that not because he was religiously or because religious truths cannot be verifiable. What is religiously true is a matter of belief. Either I believe it or I don't. You cannot verify it, and therefore the nature of political authority is different from the nature of religious authority. So the idea of invoking the Rashidun as the model, of course, it was not a state in the sense that we understand the state today to be, and it was not an Islamic state. The Rashidun were fighting each other. You know, the Uthman, the third caliph, was murdered in his house. When the major other companions of the Prophet were in Medina and did not rise to defend him, he was buried in the Jewish cemetery. because he was not accepted to be a Muslim enough to be buried in the Muslim cemetery. This is the third caliph. So the notion of Rashidun as the ideal Islamic state was a myth. It's something that people, it is part of that discourse that is post-colonial, I'm saying. Now, about questions of course you are right that the devil is in the detail, or the divine or God is in the detail as originally phrased, but the point is that that's what I mean by mediation. So if you take the question about family law or personal status law, to me that is always secular. The fact that people call it Islamic family law does not make it Islamic. And it is in fact a colonial product. The idea of Islamic family law is a colonial idea that sort of brought the idea of sort of isolating a field of law that is left to Muslim beliefs, and the rest of law and administration was transformed into colonial administration. So we will not find this idea back in Muslim sources or history. The term again, ahwal al-shakhsiyya itself is, or Islamic sort of family law is not there in that history. But so we have to understand these issues so that the nature of the enactment of statutory Sharia defies codification. Why? Because there are competing views about what the Sharia position is on every single issue. And whenever you enact, you will have to select a position over other positions. And nobody has that authority except the believer herself. So as a believer, I can choose this view or that view. But no other external political authority can define to me what is right and what is wrong, religiously speaking. So the ahwal shakhsiyya, the personal law, status law, as I say, is a secular legislation that claims divine authority, but it is not. There are many points to make. Unfortunately, time. But the question of methodology, the way that these statutes came to be enacted. If you lived in Egypt, you know it. It was a secular state political choice, not a religiously defined and derived choice. And take the question about khula, that is a form of divorce which women can achieve by renouncing financial entitlements. Khula was, the term actually itself means to take off. And it's about a woman's ability to buy herself out of a bad marriage by renouncing her financial entitlements. This concept is an original Sharia concept, existed in fiqh throughout the centuries. But it was not available to Egyptian women until the Egyptian state in 2000 adopted a statute that made khul part of Egyptian law for the first time in the modern history of the Egyptian state. So if it was a question of Sharia, it should have been available to women regardless of what the state thought of it. But it did not become available until the state said so. And when the state said it with its own conditions about how it works. About niqab in France, these are the type of questions where the mediation has to happen. That is, for me, it is, and the French state maybe it's trying to do that. It is as oppressive of women for the French state to mandate how women should dress, as it is for the Saudi or Iranian state to mandate how women should dress. The difference might be if the state can justify its claim on civic reason idea. That is, you can, for example, say you cannot have a niqab if you want to apply for a driver's license, because we have to know how you look, and therefore, covering your face, you don't have a right to drive, but it is a license that you can get if you satisfy the legal requirements. One of the legal requirements is that you have to know how you look. But you cannot say that even privately, even on the street, you cannot wear this and the other. If you apply to schools, as the French did, again, you have to justify that. And the French tried to justify it. Whether you accept the justification or not is another question. But the idea is that the state did not simply mandate. And maybe the difference between France and Saudi Arabia is that the French state tried to justify its position. The Saudi state evokes divine justification for its position. The difference to me is, do you say women have to dress this way because God said so? Or do you say that women have to dress this way because of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6? If you use civic reasons arguments, then I can debate that. But if you invoke divine command, what can I do about it? I saw a hand on this side, if not. Yes, actually, the first time, then I will do good like that.
How do you then, two questions. One, how do you construe issues like the Bill of Rights, which were essentially to protect minority rights, which often come into issues like religious discourse, like the Amish, comes up as a matter of judgment. And so it becomes part of civic reason in order to bring this out. So it's not, it can't be such a categorical statement, it seems like at one level. This runs a spectrum rather than just kind of a black or white issue.
Right.
And then the second is kind of a procedural question. How do you see implementing this in the best possible way? Does this have to take place within Islamic communities, whether at the state or local level, say in terms of ijtihad, and then they adopt concepts like civic reason? Or it seems like you can't top down it by bringing in political concepts except through educational instruments. So, I mean, when you're making a seemingly larger break with traditional Islam, how are you going to bring this about in a way that is amenable to most parties?
Okay. On the first point, that the idea of the Bill of Rights is a civic reason idea. It is an idea about creating and so on. And those types of ideas are foundational for their ability to protect the civic reason process. That is, it is by human agreement that we find that by experience, if we protect freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and other fundamental rights, then we are enabling everybody else to be as religious as they choose to. But the question of mediation, as we know, the Supreme Court jurisprudence or otherwise, about the Amish or any other religious minority, public education, about questions.
Well, it's in the job, right? I mean,
yes.
Doesn't that give some credence to speaking about your faith in the public sphere, because that's the reason that you want to articulate as to why you want to wear it. That civic reason or public reasons don't really completely enter into it at some level. They often do, maybe most often, but not all the time.
Correct. My point is that civic reason becomes essential when we are dealing with state policy and legislation, not with all types of discourses. So, I mean, morally, ethically, socially, people interact and have all sorts of reasons and congregate, and all of that is fine. My concern is just the sphere of the state as such, that you cannot bring that sort of religious conviction into state institutions. But as I said, I think in my earlier remarks, civic reason is not totally absent, is not sufficiently present. It is something that even in religious discourse, there is a civic reason dimension. That people, when they mention Sharia said so, they always try to justify that in terms of experience and what is good and what is bad and what outcomes are and so on. So it's about protecting sexual propriety because this is protecting social stability. So the impulse, the why question is a very powerful question. And the impulse to justify even your religious convictions, even to other co-believers, is also inherent even in religious discourse. That's why I was saying that we just need to cultivate that, to say that, and of course, even if we talk about this country, how political decisions are made, how political choices are made, how legislation is enacted, is a very strange mix of religious and civic or public discourse. You cannot really get into people's hearts as to why they vote the way they do. And many of the reasons people vote the way they do have to do with the religious convictions. So, but there is enough civic reason in this country for a pluralistic democratic constitutional system to continue to thrive. But that is not a foregone conclusion. It can collapse. It can collapse on any crisis issue. It almost collapsed over the health care issue. It might collapse over other types of political, the abortion question and so on. So there is a question of a public consensus on the need for civic reason, always in tension with, in a state of tension with, the impulse to evoke your religious conviction as a reason for public policy. And that's why I call it mediation and paradox, is that it is a difficult process. Procedurally, which is your second point, which is quite related, is that, as I said, you start where you are. My claim is that everywhere, even in Iran or Saudi Arabia, civic reason is not totally absent, but it is not sufficiently present. And more importantly, it is not institutionalized. But I think that people's experience will tell that, in fact, they accept the premise even if they are unable to articulate a religious justification for it. And just to quote some demographics here, Muslims are, at least by the US, the CIA Book of World Facts, 1/4 of humanity are Muslims. That 1 in every 4 persons is a Muslim, self-identifying as a Muslim. There are more than 40 states where Muslims are the majority of the population. 40 states. 1/4 of the membership of the United Nations are states where Muslims are the majority. How many can you remember now or think of where this issue is a hot issue or a debated issue? That is my point, is this. Except for Iran, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, now it's no longer the case really, and Pakistan is still ambivalent. Except those 4 or 5 situations, 36 out of 40 countries are countries where the Muslims are the predominant majority who are not contesting this question. In fact, Senegal is 96% Muslim. Gambia is 98% Muslim. Mali is 98 or 89 at least percent Muslim. And all of these are constitutionally secular states, self-describing as secular states. Indonesia is a secular state. The largest Muslim population in the world is a secular state. It has been from the start in 1945. It was never an Islamic state. The state of Indonesia being Islamic is not. So my point is that has never been contested. So my point is that the way Muslims live their lives is with secular state whose authority and legitimacy they accept. That in a few situations that get to be highly politicized and highly featured in the media and so on are the ones that we think about. When we think about Islam and Islamic State, we think about Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is the least Islamic state that can ever be. It has nothing to do with Islam, really, but by my conviction and my belief. The very idea that Iran claims to be an Islamic republic and Saudi Arabia claims to be an Islamic monarchy. To each other, they are heresies. That is, for Iranian 12er Shiism, the Wahhabi doctrine is a heresy. To the Wahhabi doctrine of Saudi Arabia, Shia doctrine is a heresy. So what does Islamic mean if we have 2 diametrically opposed states, both claiming to be Islamic? That's what I meant about the fact that it is unverifiable. There is no notion of what Islamic is that we can apply to one state or another. So you are right, of course, that the difficulty is in the political currency of what I'm talking about. But if it wasn't difficult, I wouldn't be doing it. You know that this is often, we lose this point. We talked earlier about the Reformation. The people who were doing the Reformation were not aware they were doing the Reformation when it was happening. You know, like Luther did not go up and nail those, if he did that, I mean, this myth of his nailing those 10 points on the church door, he wasn't saying, I'm starting the revelation, the Christian Reformation. He did what he did because he felt that was the right thing to do. And it took 200 years for that view to prevail, and now for us 200 years later to look back and say that was the Christian Reformation. The American Revolution, when it was happening, the American so-called patriots were not aware they were making the American Revolution. So the nature of history is that we tend to, in retrospect, to understand what happened in the broader terms. But at the time, people are just simply struggling to protect human rights, to democratization, to protect their livelihood and so on. So you are right that you cannot impose it top down. My claim that what I'm saying is articulating what most Muslims believe. But they have not articulated it in those terms, and that's why I feel compelled to do so. Yes, okay, 1 and 2.
I have a question. You've been paralleling with what Carl Jaspers, the existentialist, said in the 1940s, I believe, when he said that our political institutions are very infused with biblical ideas and images. So, in your concept of civic reason, I don't know if it's a sort of a shadowy figure for me, this concept of reason as a theoretical concept, because as you said before, when you were at your meeting, that people, you said to these people, leave your religious convictions at the door. And I don't know if that's really possible in this concept of reason, because I think they're so, as you might say, they're unconsciously infused together.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if we can empirically draw the line between reason and religious conviction, even though we don't claim that we're, citing the prophet, etc.
Yes.
So.
Correct, and that's why I was talking about that, what I call the tripartite question about constitutionalism, human rights, and citizenship. These are normative and institutional devices to help us negotiate that. I mean, the person is one person. I mean, like, I don't step out of my skin to engage in civic reason and then go back into my skin to practice my religious conviction. I'm the same person, right? But what I meant about cultivating the quality of civic reason is to say that when I engage with other citizens in debates about public policy, I should not invoke the authority of my religious conviction as the reason for the policy to be adopted. It's counterintuitive. It doesn't come natural, but it is something that we have to cultivate. Like all aspects of social life. I would rather do things as I like to do them and be whatever I want to be, but I realize that there are limitations on, so long as I accept the social, that's why I was talking about the generalist theory. So long as I accept social life, I accept limitations on my choices. I accept limitations on my reasons and my reasoning process. That's why it is a paradox to be mediated. It is not straightforward, but I think we can say that sort of envisioning how we would feel if we are subjected to someone else's religious conviction as the reason for public policy. The golden rule idea is a very powerful argument, and that I make it all the time. So when I talk to Sunnis, I will say, think how you would feel if a Shia state is to impose Shia doctrine on you as a matter of state law. And when I talk to Shia, I don't do as much, but I make the same argument. So the point is that we can reasonably see that it is better to engage in civic reason than to engage in invoking religious convictions. Because we disagree about our religious convictions, and because our religious convictions are so fundamental to who we are, we should not make them the basis of public policy, which can change. And that is the possibility of changing public policy is key. If you allow civic reason to be the justification, you can change your mind about it. And countries like Sudan or Pakistan get trapped into enacting so-called Sharia statutes in the 1980s, Zia in Pakistan and Numeri in Sudan, and nobody can change it now politically because who will go against Sharia? But if you say that this is not Sharia to start with, it might become possible for politicians to change. So the point I'm saying is that it is the same person. It takes really a great effort. And I think you do it in this country, and you see it happen in this country. When people debating abortion, for example, as a very emotional and very powerful debate, often most people are driven by religious conviction, but they do not articulate those religious convictions as the primary reason for changing the policy. They try to think of other ways of trying to argue and persuade. That's what I mean about it. It's not easy, but it's something that we should invest in. Yes, please.
Two questions. So, in terms of your theory of the secular state and putting forth this so-called exclusivist position, a position that excludes religious reasoning from public debate on policy, you're joining a long line of well-known scholars like Robert Audi, Richard Rorty, who called religion a conversation stopper, even Jürgen Habermas, even Rawls. Are you simply reaffirming that argument that they've put forward, or are you adding something unique and different to it. So that's my first question. The second question goes back to your argument that this diffusion of religion and state is not something that's rooted in the Quran, that it's a modern post-colonial construction. I have a hard time, so I want to push you also as something else did earlier on that, because it seems to me that it's hard to view even Muhammad himself as someone who wasn't a figure who represented both spiritual, military, legal, and political leadership all in one. Is it not true that the year zero of the Islamic calendar is the migration from Mecca to Medina and the establishment of a polity, a community of believers that was linked, that was united not only spiritually but politically under a state?
Okay. On the first point, I think I would disagree completely with those scholars that you mentioned. My object is not to exclude religion. My object is to enable religion. The opening sentence in the book Islam and the Secular State, the first sentence in the first chapter, I say that I need the state to be secular so that I can be Muslim by conviction and choice, which is the only way to be a Muslim. And I did say in my remarks, opening remarks, I said that to me the secular state is a means to being religious, not the exclusion of religion. So, I mean, and I did say also in my remarks that I reject secularism as a humanist sort of philosophy. I'm a believer, and my belief is foundational to my very identity and sense of being. And for that, I need to organize the state in a way that enables me to be as believing by conviction and choice as everybody else should be able to do so or not, as the case may be. So it is, to me, the secular state is a means to being religion, to be religious, not an exclusion of religion.
But it is privileging in the public sphere secularism.
Not the public sphere, the state sphere. People can debate in public and use any language they will choose, any conversation they engage in. My point is that the state is a very limited but vitally important and very delicate sort of sphere. That you should not use the state institutions to advance a religious doctrine. Actually, the First Amendment is a genius formulation for this. I mean, in fact, the project I'm working on now, I call it American Muslims and American Secularism, Enhancing Citizenship. And the title, you know, like this is, I'm testing here, the title I'm thinking of using for the book I will hope to write is called it The Islamic Republic of the United States, ? You know, I will soften it by the question mark. Because my claim is that the United States, the way that you have this First Amendment formula of this establishment and protection of practice of religion is such a genius formulation that in fact it is most enabling for one to be Muslim more than living in any other Muslim majority country today. That is my claim, and as I said, the title, hopefully, if the publisher agrees, will do that. But the point is that it is about how to be religious in the variety and many, and how to be moral, how to be ethical, how to be, you know, nobody is defined by being believer only. Yeah, I'm a Muslim, yes, but I'm many other things. And in all those variety of other things, I can engage in all sorts of conversations, including presenting my position as a Muslim in those conversations. My point is that if we want to get into the state institutional authority, if you want to invoke a state's coercive authority to enforce a view, that should not be based on religious conviction. But the rest of life can be engaging in all sorts of conversation. On the, now I lost track of the slide on the second point.
Was it Muhammad?
Yes, Muhammad. If you remember, I said it hopefully shockingly enough to be remembered. I said that Muhammad was too exceptional to be relevant. That is, unless we can conceive of another prophet, what applies to Muhammad does not apply to any other human being, because to the Muslim believer, he was the source of what Islam is. So whatever he said Islam is Islam for the believers. Okay? Of course, some other scholar who might come and read and actually say the Quran was written 500 years later, all of that, it happens. But for the believer, I believe that Muhammad delivered the Quran from God. And to me, what Muhammad said is Islam. That does not apply to any other human being. So when you say when Muhammad himself did that, even I'm coming to that, he did not actually do it, but I'm coming to that. But the point is that if you say that, then you are not saying really much, because he was too exceptional for whatever applied to him to apply to anybody else. Now coming to the idea of his uniting the political and the social, that was only for the believers. You know, Medina, you know, there's something called the Charter of Medina, which was a compact between the Christians, Muslims, and Jews, primarily Muslims and Jews of Medina. So, to the extent that the Medina state was a state, it was a secular state. To the believers, it was not a state at all, because the nature of the relationship to the Prophet was not that nature. But for the Jews of Medina, who did not accept Muhammad as a prophet, they did not accept what he was doing as religious at all. So in that sense, it was a secular state, to the extent that we can think of it as a state. But if you think of, you know, what we mean by the state today, I mean, the notion of the state today is so dramatically different. It's hierarchical, bureaucratic, coercive, centralized, intrusive, in ways that it is difficult to think of what was going on in Medina as a state at all. But to the extent that it was a state, it was a secular state. Because the basis of his compact with the Jews, or the way that they accepted his authority, is not because it was a religious authority, but because it was a political authority. Think about it. Yes, you had your hand earlier on.
I wanted to examine more closely, I'm sure you've thought about this, your notion of the state being neutral, neutrality of the state. All these discussions, I feel that that's really the ultimate issue, even in the United States. You said neutrality doesn't mean
Indifferent.
hostile
Oh, yeah.
to religion. Now, even in the United States, this genius First Amendment, many people believe that, for example, not allowing a Christmas creche on public land is hostile to religion. So, yesterday there was a Supreme Court decision about a Christian symbol on the Washington Wall. It was allowed. It will be allowed to stand. So the state, I think the neutrality of this idea you have the neutrality of the state is a very, it's too idealistic. I mean, the state, so what is neutral to one party is hostility by the other party, or too much friendliness by the third party. So insofar as the state is going to have to decide, okay, well, what are we going to allow? I see a real problem in this mediator being neutral.
Yes, you are right. But neutrality to me is not a given. The neutrality of the state, of course, by one point is that I'm not talking about the neutrality of the state regarding everything. It's regarding religious doctrine in particular, meaning that the state does not promote a particular religious view or prohibit. That's what the First Amendment.
Right. Well, that is the
No, but
point.
I'm saying, but it is not a given. It is something that we work at. It is something that we cultivate. It's something that we protect. So when I mentioned constitutionalism, human rights, and citizenship, as a means of, and I call it mediation. In the title itself, I call it. The title is Framework for Constant Contestation, not a claim for categorical resolution. So now here's the point, that you have over time, it wasn't from day one, over time you have built institutions like the Supreme Court. You have built a jurisprudence. You have built political culture. So the American state is more neutral about religion today than it has been at the beginning, and that it might not remain so. So the question, therefore, is it is up to you, and the notion of citizenship in the title or in that formulation is to say that it is up to citizens to make sure. To me, the ACLU is as important as the Supreme Court. it is the ability of citizens to organize, to contest. And there are institutions on the other side of the bucket fund or whoever. So to think of that these are competing claims about what separation of religion and the state means. Competing claims about what neutrality of the state regarding religious doctrine means. And then you get an adjudication, ultimately in the Supreme Court. But that adjudication is authoritative but not final, meaning it is not eternal. You can change your mind and Supreme Court changes and their jurisprudence changes. And in fact, here you get it, that's why it is something very much in terms of, it is a very fragile thing. The public consensus or the sort of national consensus you have about certain institutions is constantly being tested. And if people are not vigilant, if people are not careful, they will lose that balance and they will destroy that consensus. And the time will come when this happens. You know, it will happen. You know, there is going to be a time when there is no United States of America. You know, I said this one time and people were shocked. Nothing human is permanent. Everything human is transient. There will be people living in this part of the world, but it will no longer be the United States of America. It will happen. And how soon? I don't wish it, but I know it will happen. There has never been a human institution, a human civilization, a human ideal that is permanent. So what makes the United States is the ability of the citizens of the United States to keep it so. And what will end the United States, is the failure of its citizens to keep it so. So when people 500 years, maybe 50 years from now, look up and say that there was a powerful, great, quote-unquote civilized state called the United States of America, and they will study it as a historical phenomenon. What went wrong? You know, the famous Bernard Lewis phrase. There will be a time when people will say what went wrong, because something will go wrong. The thing is that it is my agency, my responsibility while I'm here is to try to prevent that from happening. So the neutrality is not a given, and it is not a permanent state of affairs. It is something that we sort of strive at every day. Yes?
I have a question about the distinction that is maybe implied in what you say between religious convictions and religious doctrines and normative beliefs or values in general that are also non-verifiable in many ways. I mean, I think in the end, when you talk about civic reason, and you say that we need to invoke other reasons that are not religious, but I think it's hard to distinguish between let's say other kind of convictions that are also non-verifiable, but I mean humanism is based on a lot of convictions that are non-verifiable, the belief or the whole debate about abortions. I mean, even if statements that are not religious are invoked, a lot of times they invoke other kinds of convictions that are not verifiable. So how would that be considered religious or secular, or how do you make that distinction?
Again, I agree with you that, as I said, it is not a categorical resolution. That is, many questions in life about values, about social behavior, about conviction, all sorts of things will continue to be contestable, debatable, and so on. All my concern is with a very specific but extremely important space, which is state institutions. So yes, sort of people who engage in, I believe this is right, I believe this is wrong, and sometimes I can persuade by using and try to think of reasons to persuade you to accept what I think is right or wrong. That will continue, and there is no way of ending that type of conversation. And the object is not to end that type of conversation. In fact, the object is to enable that type of conversation by protecting state institutions, because once a state institution adopts a religious doctrine, then end of conversation, exactly as Rotary and others were quoted. The meaning that, what can I say to that? If you say, this is the way it is because God said so, either I accept that really God said so, or I don't. In either case, there is nothing much I can do about it. Because if I accept it, then what can I say to God? And if I don't, then what can I say to the believer who believes that God said so? But so our ability to be persuasive is important for public policy, for legislation. It is also important for other fields, but we cannot expect it to be as it is not going to be the end of the conversation about all sorts of values that we accept and live by. And in fact, that is what is the genius of being human is about. It is, human difference is really the essence of being human. Because to me, it is the divine in the human. It is the ability to be different, and the right to be different, and the need to be different. And that we always find ways of distinguishing ourselves from other people. The question is not to negate difference, but to enable difference in a way that sustains social stability and political stability. That is the challenge. You know that one of the most powerful definitions of human rights is by Albie Sachs, who said, the South African constitutional justice, who said that human rights are about the right to be the same and the right to be different. So it is as important to be different as it is to be the same, meaning to be treated the same in my difference. So for protecting my human rights is to protect me as I am, not as someone else would like me to be. So those types of conversations, that is what philosophy, all sorts of very beautiful, powerful things will keep going on. But so long as we keep the state stable, respectful of fundamental rights, controlled, limited by constitutionalism, keeping that limited space as neutral as we can will enable everything else to happen. But sacrificing that neutrality to the extent that we can make it and sustain it will undermine everything else. So it is not a claim that everything has to be verifiable or quantifiable. It's not even the ability to be persuasive about everything. The color of, the way I choose my color of hair or color, I cannot persuade, I don't need to persuade anybody else. But I might inspire someone else to follow my example about that. But those types of conversations and lifestyle choices and all of that will go on. But just for this limited but very important sphere of the state, let us try to make it and keep it as neutral as we can.
I think we have time for one more.
Okay, one more question.
A quick question. It seems to me you are trying to establish a paradigm where Muslims, be they in the majority or minority, can live with it. Am I correct? Or?
Yes.
Having said that, if one thinks of two issues, human rights and democracy, how do you see this paradigm feasible, knowing the reality now? In other words, the latest thing, let us say, have one quick example. You mentioned Indonesia. The very recent thing, the Supreme Court, the blasphemy law said, okay, it's a valid law and everything. Yes, it goes against anything you are talking about or you aspire for.
Sure. That, to me, democracy and human rights are a process, are not events. That is, again, they evolve over time. They can have setbacks. They can have, in fact, sometimes reversals. But and every human society is constantly living with taking risks. I mean, human societies take risks to affirm something or to reject something. For me, the question about neutrality, about religion, is to keep the choices open. So if we as human beings disagree on a public policy, knowing that it is our human agency that's at issue, we can change our mind. So the Indonesian Supreme Court may have affirmed this notion of blasphemy, but because it is a civic or sort of a secular state institution, it can reverse itself. But if it said, this is so because God said so, then it cannot change its mind about it. So keeping the ability to change its mind, our minds, is what I'm talking about. Protect our ability to change our mind. If we inject God into the conversation, it is a false claim because really we don't know what God is or what God is about. It's unknowable. So it is a false claim. But to me, it's also a very dangerous claim. So stay out of the danger and stay out of the heresy of claiming that you know what God intended to do.